Welcome to the Connerland APUSH review, period 3.
Alright guys, as Avery was kind enough to say, this is the Continental Period 3 review for APUSH. As always, we're going to have three key concepts within this period, and it's going to deal basically from the road to revolution to the signing of the Constitution and a couple of events that happened afterwards. So, having said that, as always, we're going to start with key concept 3.1, which is going to deal with kind of the road to revolution, how we went from the events that happened after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War as we have called it, leading into the conflicts between Britain and the colonists that ultimately led to the American Revolution and the beginning of America. Alright, so as always, the key concepts are broken down into a question and answer format. The first question that we have under key concept 3.1 is how and why did various American Indian groups evaluate and adjust their alliances throughout the second half of the 18th century? Well, first answer to that as far as the why did they evaluate and adjust their alliances is the fact that English population growth and expansion disrupted French and Indian trade networks and caused Indian nations to shift alliances. The first way in which this worked, as far as the population growth and expansion, is that the British were just streaming into native lands left and right. And the British attempted to control this with the Proclamation of 1763, which, as we talked about in class, was this imaginary line that was drawn down the Appalachian Mountains. And what they said was no colonists can go west of this line. Well, the reaction of it, as we talked about, colonists ignored it and kept encroaching on native lands. So, in response to that, how did native groups attempt to resist the encroachment of British colonists? The big one is that it comes in the form of rebellion with Pontiac's Rebellion, which you should have on your terms and know the causes of it and events and results, as everything else that we talk about. Second part, or the second answer to this question, is during and after the Revolutionary War, tribes attempted to form alliances with one another and with European powers. And the main question with that would be, why did they do this? Well, it's pretty self-obvious. Number one, they want to protect their interests, be it economic or just keeping their society intact. Number two, they wanted to limit the migration of English or white settlers as they continue to move westward with the population growth and expansion. And three, maintain their tribal lands as these English settlers began to encroach on their lands. Like I said, they had to get this land from somewhere, and they were taking it from natives. So they're doing all these things in effect to save their society, if you want to look at it like that. All right, the second part of this is how are the following examples of how tribes attempted to do this? I'll grant you not worded exactly perfectly, but I'm doing what I can with it. So what they did as far as shifting alliances, number one was the Iroquois Confederation. And what they did is they kind of changed the way that they approached the British and dealt with the British over time. At first, they were aligned with them when the British began to come into North America. But as time goes on and the 7 Years' War or French and Indian War breaks out, between France and Britain, they decide to kind of hedge their bets and see how it's going to go. So they go neutral during the 7 Years' War. After the war, they change completely, or 180 against the British, and go completely against them. So as you look at the change over time, they were aligned with the British, went neutral, and were completely against them, depending on what time we're talking about. Another example of this is Chief Little Turtle in the Western Confederation, who signed a peace treaty with the British that allowed for steady immigration by the British. And the reason that they did this was to keep themselves from getting overrun with British settlers. They were looking for a way to kind of control how many people came in and at what pace that they did. All right, our second major question under Key Concept 3.1, what economic and political factors united the colonies against Britain and eventually led to the Revolutionary War? In other words, what caused the road to revolution? Well, the first answer to that is Great Britain attempted to consolidate imperial control over colonial markets, taxes, and political institutions in order to pay the debts accrued from the 7 Years' War. In other words, Britain is trying to raise money off the colonists, and there's two examples of this, or two components, and they are the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts. Now, just because I've got two listed right here doesn't mean you don't need to know everyone that we went over in class. So make sure you hammer all these components, but know these two apply to this question. All right, so our first component is the Stamp Act. As everything else that we do in this course, you need to know the purpose of it, you need to know the events of it, and then the reaction of it from the colonist side. So the purpose of the Stamp Act was to simply raise revenue to support new soldiers in the colonies. In other words, the British felt that the colonists should pay for their own defense in some way, shape, or form. As far as the provisions of the Stamp Act go, remember it is not a tax on stamps. Please do not put that on anything. All right, it is a stamp on paper goods that signifies that the tax has been paid. And this is any kind of paper good or legal document. It can be any kind of legal document, birth certificate, marriage certificate, death certificate, news players, playing cards, anything that is basically made out of paper. So the big question would be, how did the colonists view this action taken by the British? And to be honest with you, they didn't take it really well because they felt like there was a complete difference between legislation and taxation. They felt that legislation was fine when it was in the form of external taxes, in other words, tariffs or things like that. that didn't directly come out of the colonists' pocketbook. They believed that when it came to taxation, things that they actually had to pay for, it should be solely the domain of local governments. It should be their rights. And by Britain passing the Stamp Act, they didn't really line up with either of these things that the colonists approved of from their point of view. Now, from the British view, they thought it was all totally well and good because they believed in something called virtual representation, which meant that even though the colonists didn't have someone physically sitting in Parliament representing them, because they were a part of the British Empire, they were virtually represented. So, from Britain's point of view, they were taking care of the concerns of the colonists and all that kind of stuff. So, they felt that you were represented even if you didn't have a voted member of Parliament. So here's what happens. The colonists are protesting this thing so loudly that they eventually organize and form what's called the Stamp Act Congress, which was put together to demand an end to the Stamp Act. They're actually going to holler at Britain and tell them that they should end it because it's not fair and it's not right. The significance of it is probably the most important thing, is that it set a precedence for resistance against the British that we're going to see manifest itself when it comes to the actual events close to the Revolutionary War. So as far as the results of the Stamp Act Congress, what it really does is they decide they're going to boycott Britain. In other words, they're not going to allow any British goods to be imported into the colonial America. And once they do this, it begins to hurt England financially to the point where British manufacturers and shippers eventually start making some noise with regards to Parliament, telling them how it's hurting. So England kind of throws their hands up at it, and in 1766, they repeal the Stamp Act. In other words, they get rid of it. So moving on down the line a little bit, like I said, you need to know all of these acts and all of these things that happened on the road to revolution, but we're moving to one of the main events of it in the Intolerable Acts, which happened in 1774. Now, the Intolerable Acts were a direct response to the Boston Tea Party. We went over the components of it in class, so I'm not going to do it here. But the purpose of it is the first thing that Britain does to actually punish the colonists for something that they had done. So the purpose of the Intolerable Acts is strictly to punish Boston. As far as the provisions of the Intolerable Acts, the first and probably the most important and most devastating to the colonists is the Port Act, which closed the harbor of Boston. In other words, they completely blockaded it. No products going in, no products going out, and it devastated the economy of Boston and to a certain extent the Northeast. They also revoked the Charter of Massachusetts. In other words, they lost their status as a colony. Also, officials were to be tried in England, whereas before they would be tried in the colonies. And also, they kind of beefed up the Quartering Act, which had to do with the housing and supplying of British soldiers. In response to the Intolerable Acts, the response is the creation of the First Continental Congress, which just simply is a way to file grievances against Britain. In other words, they wrote a letter telling the king and Parliament how they were, kind of messing them over. They didn't declare independence or anything like that at this point. They're just writing a list of complaints over the actions of the British. All right, so we've looked at the two major acts that you need to be aware of. Obviously, all of them are in play, but those are the two big ones. Now we move forward to look at how the colonists reacted to each of these acts as they were put on. And it goes a variety of ways. It's from demonstrations to protests to outright violence. So you get tarring and feathering, you get physical intimidation, you get rocks thrown in the street, whatever it is. But they kind of run the gamut or run the whole span of ways in which people would protest something being done against them. Moving along from some of the reactions to some outright actions that colonists took against the acts of the British, one of the things that was set up was the Committees of Correspondence. And one of the things you need to know is how did they reflect a form of colonial resistance to the acts that we've talked about up to this point? And they did it in several ways. Number one, they were made up of people kind of higher standing, of higher economic and social classes, because they had some kind of interest in what was going on. Also, it was a means of maintaining communication lines about their grievances against the British. So basically, the Committees of Correspondence is a communication network. It's like the Revolutionary War equivalent of email, if you want to look at it like that. And as it did these things, it built solidarity among colonial leaders because they were all concerned about the things that Britain was doing in some way, shape, or form, and were able to kind of coordinate their responses and what was going on. All right, our next point under this topic is the fact that the resulting independence movement was fueled by established colonial elites along with others and rested on many arguments. And the arguments were as follows. Number one, colonists were concerned about their rights as British subjects. They didn't feel it was fair or that it violated their rights as British subjects when Britain was putting these acts and taxes and things like that on them. Also, they were concerned about the rights of the individual. Now, this comes directly from the influence of the Enlightenment, which we talked about in class. Next thing you need to know is how did the following reflect the issues that were at the center of the American Revolution. So how did people respond to these taxes? How did they file their grievances? How did they do what they did? The first group is the Sons of Liberty. Now the first thing you need to realize about the Sons of Liberty is that these were not the colonial elites, because these guys were being scrutinized and watched by the British. So this was a group of like craftsmen and tradesmen and people kind of, I guess, middle class would be the best way to call it. These are guys who represented the opposition to the Stamp Act. They put together violence in some cases to go against the tarring and feathering and all that kind of stuff. Next is Mercy Otis Warren, who was a poet and writer, wrote a lot of propaganda, which we talked about propaganda in class. Wrote a lot of things that were published anonymously that kind of grew sentiment against the Stamp Act and the other things that the British were doing. And then lastly, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which was written by a guy named John Dickinson, written in opposition to the Townshend Acts. Now, Dickinson wasn't a farmer, but he took kind of the persona of one to represent how the things that Britain was doing could impact like a common man or a common farmer or what have you. All right, so moving forward to some of the components leading into the war, despite the many advantages enjoyed by the British at the start of the war, the Patriot cause succeeded. So I guess the question of this would be, how did we actually pull this off? How did we win? First thing we'll look at is the main advantages that the British had. First of all, they had some kind of support here in the colonies in the form of loyalists, or people who were loyal to the crown. Also, they had a lot of military and financial advantages. They had one of the best militaries and the best navy in the world at this time, and also a lot more money than a group of rebels does in this case. As far as kind of how you could win, I guess looking at this graph down here, this little chart down here, it kind of gives the goals of each side going into the war. From the American side, all we had to do, and we talked about this in class, is fight a war of attrition. We didn't necessarily have to win, we just had to make Britain quit. We were also going to fight more of a guerrilla style. It's partly because our military is not as trained as the British, and also because we don't really have the supplies and manpower to fight in that style. And also, we've got to form some kind of alliance, which we do, which we'll talk about in a second, or as we talked about in class with the Franco-American alliance. As far as the British go, they're going to try to separate the North and South. They realize we don't have a lot of resources and manpower, and the further they can spread us out and isolate us, the better it's going to work out for them. Also, the blockade ties into that and the divide and conquer as well. All right, so as far as I've said before, you don't really have to know a lot of battles and things in this class. Like turning points are the ones that started, but that's about it. So we're going to skip forward to why were the colonists finally able to win this war. Well, first of all, they had a familiarity with the geography of America. They knew where to hide. They knew where to go. They knew the best places to fight battles, and the British just didn't have that. So familiarity with the land. Also, military and political leadership. We did have pretty good leadership during this war, or phenomenal leadership during this war. Along with that, a resiliency and the fact that we were fighting for a cause and would not give up. Also, the ideological commitment to liberty and the fact that, once again, we wouldn't give up because we were fighting for a cause, and support from European allies in the form of the Franco-American alliance. All right, the third part of Key Concept 3.1 deals with why did the United States have to debate and formulate foreign policy initiatives and assert an international presence after the war? Well, the first reason we had to do this was a lot of them didn't leave. All right, there's still European powers in America. So as far as the challenges go that we had to face, number one, we have to deal with border security. As you look at this map, yeah, we have kicked England for the most part, out of North America, but there is still a heavy Spanish presence on the southern part of our new country and on the western part. Also, we've got to maintain neutral treaty rights and things like that, and also promote our economic interests. We've got to figure out how to do this. As I said in class, we're a baby country. We're trying to take baby steps, and we've got to figure this stuff out pretty quickly or it's going to turn south. Another thing we've got to concern ourselves about is the spread of the French Revolution throughout Europe and how it's going to impact the way that we do stuff. Now, there are two camps that come up over the French Revolution with regards to the way that Americans see it, and you've got support on one side where they think it's the rising up or, kind of a rising up of the common man in the same vein as the American Revolution, so some people support it. And then on the other side, you have the elites of the new country who are scared to death of it because they feel the same thing could happen here, whereas the common people could rise up and take out the authority. Go from support to hope. And last but not least, is Washington's farewell address. You need to be aware that there are two main things that Washington warns against in this address, and they're foreign alliances and political parties. And they're simply because he believes we're just not ready for this at this point. All right, then the last thing we've got to worry about in 3.1 is why were these two things becoming more difficult to do after Washington left office, as far as staying out of foreign alliances and the formation of political parties. It's simply because of European conflicts and the conflicts that arise in America because of what's happening between Britain and France. All right, that wraps up key concept 3.1. Part 2 will deal with 3.2, and we'll move on from there.